So, you think you could last against a knight? Maybe you lift in the gym, run marathons, or even train in modern martial arts. But step back in time, stand in a muddy field, and face a man forged from birth to kill, and the truth is brutal. You wouldn't last seconds. Movies have trained us to see knights as slow, lumbering figures, weighed down by iron and clumsy in their movements. In reality, they were elite athletes of their age, men who trained daily from childhood, who carried not just weapons, but the weight of life and death responsibility. Every strike was rehearsed, every maneuver designed to end a fight in the blink of an eye. Imagine the shock of facing someone who could sprint in full armor, mount a horse at a run, and drive steel through shields and bone without hesitation. The clash isn't heroic, it's horrifying. For you, there would be no cinematic duel, no chance to show your inner warrior. There would be a blur of movement, a crushing impact, and silence. This is the difference between modern fantasy and medieval reality. And once you see it, you'll never look at a knight the same way again. When you think of a knight, what picture forms in your mind? Hollywood gives us the duel at dawn. Two armored men circling each other, swords clashing in slow theatrical strikes. Video games tell us knights were tanks, slow, heavy, and clumsy, surviving only by the thickness of their armor. Fantasy novels make them noble champions of honor, bound by codes that valued spectacle over slaughter. These images are burned into modern imagination. But they're lies. On a real medieval battlefield, there were no elegant duels. There was only efficiency, brutality, and speed. Knights weren't ornamental warriors. They were predators. Armor wasn't a prison of steel. It was a second skin, fitted so precisely that they could sprint, vault, and fight with agility most modern athletes would envy. To believe armor made them slow is like believing an Olympic fencer can't move, because they wear a mask. Now contrast that cinematic duel with the real thing. In a movie, the fight drags on, a ballet of sparks and flourishes. In reality, it ended in seconds. A knight's training wasn't about performance, it was about execution. A crushing blow from a mace caved in helmets. A thrust from a longsword slid between plates into the throat. They weren't fighting for choreography. They were fighting to kill as quickly and decisively as possible. Imagine the panic of a common man staring down a knight charging on horseback, lance leveled, armor gleaming in the sun. There's no exchange of witty lines or clashing steel for minutes on end. There's only the thunder of hooves, the impact of wood shattering against flesh, and the collapse of a body crumpling in the dirt. It was shock and awe, engineered through years of training and reinforced by the knight's absolute confidence in his superiority. Knights were not romantic symbols of honor. They were the shock troops of their era, professional killers designed to dominate battlefields. That is the truth behind the myth. Beneath the stories, beneath the fantasy, stood men whose speed and ruthlessness shattered illusions. And if you stepped onto that battlefield expecting a duel, you'd never even see the second strike. When we talk about medieval warfare, the spotlight almost always shines on the knight, steel-clad, noble, larger than life. But knights were only a fraction of the armies that marched across Europe. The real story belongs to the men who filled the ranks, the common soldiers. And their reality was far harsher, far more human, and in many ways, far more surprising. Most soldiers weren't born to fight. They were farmers, laborers, or townsmen who found themselves conscripted, bribed, or desperate enough to take pay for war. Their training was nothing like the lifelong drills of knights. For many, it was days or weeks of crude preparation, learning to hold a spear in a line, how to brace against a cavalry charge, or how to follow the rhythm of a commander's shout. But what they lacked in polish, they made up for in sheer necessity. Their weapons were often simple: spears, pikes, or even farming tools refashioned into instruments of war. Armor, if they had any, might be little more than a padded gambeson or a second-hand helmet dented from battles past. Against the gleaming plate of a knight, they looked pitiful. Yet history shows that in massed formations, these peasants could become terrifyingly effective. Picture a muddy field in Flanders or Switzerland. Rows of pikemen shoulder to shoulder, wooden shafts jutting outward like a wall of thorns. Individually, each man was vulnerable, but together, they could stop the unstoppable. Knights and their horses crashing into a hedge of spears, the weight of glory crumpling against the will of common men. It wasn't elegance, it was survival turned into strategy. And survival was the soldier's true skill. Imagine living on stale bread, dried fish, and whatever could be scavenged from villages razed by the march. Imagine nights spent in rain-soaked camps, wrapped in thin blankets, your boots stiff with mud, praying that disease wouldn't claim you before battle did. To be a soldier was to live on the edge of misery and still march when ordered. That kind of endurance was its own kind of toughness. Psychologically, they were hardened not by training, but by desperation. A knight fought with the confidence of wealth and heritage. A soldier fought with the knowledge that death could come, from any direction, arrows, disease, or the swing of a sword. Fear was constant, but it was also fuel. Outnumbering their enemies, working together, relying on numbers and grit, this was their path to victory. In this light, the common soldier wasn't just a backdrop for knightly glory, he was the backbone of medieval warfare. He embodied resilience, sacrifice, and the quiet kind of strength that history too often overlooks. And when enough of them stood together, they could bring even the mightiest knight to his knees. History loves its myths of knightly dominance, but hidden beneath the glittering tournaments and noble duels are moments when common soldiers not only stood their ground, but utterly shattered the illusion of knightly invincibility. These were not isolated skirmishes, they were turning points where desperation, numbers, and brutal innovation humbled the armoured elite. Take the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, often called the Battle of the Golden Spurs. On one side, heavily armoured French knights thundered forward, confident in their superiority. On the other, Flemish townsmen, artisans, weavers, butchers stood in formation, wielding long pikes and gutting hooks. The knights expected an easy slaughter. Instead, they rode into mud, their horses slowed, and their armour made them clumsy in the mire. The pike wall held. Knights fell, one after another, dragged from their mounts and cut down by men who, days earlier, had worked behind market stalls. The battlefield glittered with the gilded spurs torn from French corpses, a symbol of commoners breaking the myth, or consider the Swiss pikemen of the 14th century. They weren't noble-born warriors, they were mountain peasants hardened by rugged terrain and communal defence. But their tight spear formations and unyielding discipline became the terror of Europe. Time and again, they repelled the charge of mounted knights. At Morgarten in 1315, they ambushed Austrian knights on a narrow pass, turning the natural landscape into a death trap. As horses faltered, the pikemen pressed forward, hacking at armour joints, stabbing fallen riders, overwhelming with merciless precision. From that moment, Swiss infantry weren't just survivors, they were feared professionals, proving that numbers, discipline, and resolve could defeat the myth of knightly dominance. And then there's the English longbowmen at Crécy, 1346, and Agincourt, 1415, against thousands of French knights. Archers armed with nothing more than yew-bows and iron-tipped arrows carved chaos into armoured ranks. Each arrow wasn't just a weapon, it was time, fear, and attrition made physical. Horses reared and collapsed, knights stumbled in the mud, and those who managed to close the distance were too exhausted to fight effectively. The idea that armour made knights untouchable crumbled with each shaft that pierced plate gaps or struck unarmoured horses. The longbow taught Europe that peasant-born soldiers could decide battles once thought reserved for nobles. What these examples reveal is a truth that Hollywood often ignores. Knights weren't invincible titans striding through helpless peasants. They were human, vulnerable, and fatally dependent on terrain, weather, and the mistakes of overconfidence. Against discipline, numbers, and clever tactics, their superiority collapsed. But perhaps the most overlooked factor was psychology. When knights faced other nobles, battles resembled rituals. Captives were ransomed. Rules loosely followed. Against common soldiers, there was no such restraint. For peasants, the fight was for survival. And survival turns fear into fury. The Flemish dragging knights into muddy graves weren't thinking of glory. They were thinking of home, family, and the promise of not dying under a horse's hooves. That desperation forged a brutality knights weren't trained to face. Each of these uprisings, ambushes, and battlefield shocks chipped away at the myth. They weren't constant, and knights still dominated most encounters, but they planted seeds of change. They proved that power wasn't absolute, that a farmer with a spear, shoulder to shoulder with his neighbors, could unhorse a noble, that the battlefield was less about individual glory and more about collective will. These stories didn't just shift tactics, they shifted history. The rise of disciplined infantry formations, the proliferation of longbows and crossbows, the lessons of peasant resistance, all of it began to erode the monopoly of the mounted knight, and with it, the very idea that nobility guaranteed dominance. In the end, when soldiers fought back, they didn't just win battles, they rewrote the rules of war. If the battlefield was the stage, then the most decisive blows were often struck in the mind long before steel ever clashed. Knights carried not only swords and lances, but the weight of an entire culture built around violence. From childhood, noble boys were raised in the shadow of war, trained to ride, fight, and kill as their birthright. They were conditioned to believe themselves superior, armored in both steel and arrogance. For them, battle was not merely survival, it was performance, a demonstration of dominance, honor, and the validation of their class. Now contrast that with the common soldier. A peasant conscript or levy didn't fight for honor. He fought because he had no choice. The knight could ransom his captured noble foe, but no one paid ransom for a butcher or a farmer. Defeat for the peasant meant death. That desperation hardened men in ways knights rarely understood. Fear of annihilation gave them an edge, fighting not to win glory, but to live another day. The psychological clash between knight and soldier was, in truth, a clash between entitlement and survival. When knights faced peasants who broke and fled, it confirmed their worldview. But when peasants stood firm, shoulder to shoulder, driven by communal survival, the knight's illusion cracked. Facing men with nothing to lose unnerved even the most seasoned warrior. This invisible war of mindset often tipped the balance. Knights fought for pride, peasants fought for existence. And history shows that sometimes the will to survive proved deadlier than all the polished steel in Christendom. So where does this leave us? The image of the knight that dominates our movies, games, and imagination is seductive. A noble warrior, armored in chivalry as much as in steel. But the reality was far harsher. Knights were not clumsy figures trapped inside heavy suits, nor were they shining paragons of virtue. They were trained killers, honed from youth to dominate through speed, precision, and sheer brutality. Against them, the common soldier seemed hopelessly outmatched until history revealed otherwise. Time and again, peasants, archers, and militias stood their ground. They didn't rely on glittering armor or noble titles. They relied on desperation, ingenuity, and the will to survive. And sometimes, that was enough to humble the very warriors who believed themselves untouchable. So here's the real question. Strip away the myths, the movies, and the fantasies. How long would you last against a knight in the mud and blood of a medieval battlefield? Seconds? Minutes? Or do you believe you'd find the strength to stand shoulder to shoulder with those forgotten soldiers who proved that even legends can bleed? Drop your answer below, because history isn't just about the past. It's a challenge to you, here and now.